Welcome to episode 245 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Charlie Price, who served in the FBI for 28 years. Charlie was assigned to the New Haven, Los Angeles, and Washington field offices. Charlie also served a 2-year stint at FBI headquarters. He jokes that it was how he was able to escape from LA. In this episode, Charlie reviews the artful interview skills and techniques he used to obtain confessions and signed statements from white-collar, counterintelligence, and enemy combatant subjects. He developed an expertise obtaining confessions and was often asked by fellow agents and bureau management to conduct subject interviews of other agents' cases. Charlie obtained confessions that led to the conviction of 3 sitting members of Congress, white-collar crime criminals, corporate executives, lawyers, CPAs, child pornographers, bank robbers, drug dealers, enemy combatants and terrorists, and a spy. Charlie taught interviewing skills to FBI agents and local, state, and national law enforcement and intelligence partners as an adjunct faculty member at the FBI Academy. Since his retirement, Charlie has continued to lecture on both interviewing and how to be a good case agent. Now, I recently reviewed the movie Unthinkable, starring Samuel L. Jackson. It's all about the effectiveness of torture. And I asked Charlie what he thought about the movie and included his comments in my post, which is now up on my website, jerrywilliams.com. So you might want to check that out too. Now, if you're listening to this episode within 24 hours of when it's released, at this very moment, I could be walking out on the stage of the November 18th, 2021 FBI Agents Association's G-Man Honors Salute to Heroes event to give my keynote speech as their Distinguished Service Honoree. I'll include a gallery of photos from the event in my December Reader Team email, which I plan to title Dinner Date with the Director, since I just learned that I'm going to be sitting next to FBI Director Christopher Wray at the event. If you're not a member of my Reader Team, there's a link to join in your podcast app's description of this episode. And FYI, the FBI Agents event is a fundraiser, so I invite you to join me in donating to assist children and spouses of fallen agents and those struck by unforeseen tragedy. There's a link to where you can donate to the FBI Agents Association in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can text FBI AA to 50155. Thanks for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Charlie Price. Hi, Charlie.
Hey, Jerry. How you doing?
I'm doing great. And I am fascinated by our topic today, the artful interview. You describe it as letting the other person have it your way.
We're going to talk about, how do you talk to a person and get them to tell you the truth? And there's a methodology that works. There's a way to do it, but that way is kind of widely and wildly misunderstood. What actually works is a combination of science and art. And we'll talk about that today, and we'll kind of go behind the scenes in some real interviews that I've conducted, and we'll see how that happens in real life. We'll talk about an enemy combatant, the interview of a corporate executive, of a con man, and of a spy. And I interviewed all those folks and got them to confess. And then our podcast here will dissect what I did, why I did it, and why it works.
Perfect, because I think the best way that you can learn is when you combine the educational component with stories. And so talking about those actual interviews that you did and reviewing those cases and those situations, I think is really going to give everyone, including me, a better understanding of the techniques and methods that you use. So where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with the conventional wisdom. I think there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there about what's supposed to work. The general public just really doesn't understand this. Hollywood gets it wrong most of the time. And sadly, our colleagues in law enforcement and the intelligence community, a lot of them don't understand it either. So let's talk first about the conventional wisdom, and then we'll do like a little bit of myth busting. We'll blow up some of those myths.
I love to myth bust, so you're speaking my language.
So here's a couple of myths, and all these things I've heard people say. Hey, interviewing's just asking questions. You're going to go to logic corral and logic this person into telling the truth. Or obtaining a confession involves laying out all the evidence and convincing the subject that he's already caught, right? So therefore there's no downside in giving it up. And this actually works a lot of the time, right? Laying out the evidence. My first 7 years in the Bureau, I did this a lot, right? There's two problems with the laying out the evidence approach. Number one, you've got to get the evidence first. And I work white collar a lot. And so white collar investigations can be 2-3 years long. So if you have to lay out the evidence, you got to wait 2-3 years before you talk to somebody. And the second thing, and more importantly, even when you lay out the evidence, it doesn't always work. I had one case where I had everything on tape. The entire case was on tape. And my subject confessed about herself, but she wouldn't give it up about her colleagues, and understanding why she wouldn't do that helped me understand why I couldn't just rely on the evidence. The other kind of conventional wisdom is you got to be tough to get a confession, or you got to do the good cop, bad cop thing. The good cop, bad cop thing does work, but it doesn't work sometimes. And then the conventional wisdom is, hey, what works on dumb crooks, it's not going to work on smart crooks, or what works on smart crooks is not going to work on tough crooks, like, LGN got mafia or cartel guys. The other conventional wisdom is, hey, what works on criminals won't work on intelligence officers, because intelligence officers are professionals and they're smart, they're trained, and they're experienced. Conventional wisdom is what works on criminals and intelligence officers. It's not going to work on terrorists, because they're diehard zealots on a mission from God, right? And so they got a higher authority they're answer to, and it's just not going to work on them. And then finally, the conventional wisdom is about the use of physical abuse or torture. I've actually heard somebody say, works for Jack Bauer should work for us, right? So that's the conventional wisdom. And the fact of the matter is, none of that conventional wisdom I described is right. Some of it, like putting the evidence forward, works some of the time, but it doesn't work all the time. And the fact of the matter is, you can get, with regard to the evidence-based approach, you can get a confession without having any evidence. I've done it, and we'll talk about it today. And you could also start and end an investigation with a confession, and I've done that too. But how does that work? The one other thing I want to talk about, it just in terms of conventional wisdom, is the dreaded I word, interrogation, right? I don't like to use that word. You know why? Because the word interrogation has a lot of connotations associated with it, and those connotations are around coercion.
An adversarial relationship.
Exactly. And if you think about it, in the View, prior to September 11th, we didn't even use that word. We talked about interviews, and then we talked about subject interviews. And subject interviews was when you're interviewing the subject of a case to get a confession. So we didn't even use the word interrogation.
Right.
Right? We talked about subject interviews. And there's a reason why we didn't do that, because the coercive things that are kind of associated with interrogations, we don't do, and you don't need to do. So those are the myths. But let's talk about what actually works. So what actually works is a combination of science and art. And what you're trying to do in an artful interview is influence human behavior. And influencing it requires both the science and the art. Let's start with the science. The science I'm referring to is behavioral science, right? And there's a mountain of it. Behavioral science is important because it helps us understand, predict, and influence human behavior. So if we understand human behavior well enough, we may be able to predict it. And if we can predict that behavior, we may be able to influence it. And when you take this mountain of science, behavioral science, and you boil it down to gravy, there's two main takeaways, right? People do what's in their perceived best interest. That's really, really important.
That makes sense.
Now, perceived best interest is the opposite word. There's a difference between perceived best interest and actual best interest, right? A heroin addict, shoves a needle in his arm. That's not it doing what's in his best interest, but it's in what's his perceived best interest, because his time frame is like 5 minutes. His entire analysis is in a 5-minute window. He's not thinking more than 5 minutes ahead. So if you're only thinking about 5 minutes, maybe that is the best thing to do. But if you're thinking about the rest of your life, not the best thing to do. So the key to this is understanding the subject's perception. Because if you can change the subject's perception so that he believes it's in his best interest to tell you the truth, well, then he'll tell you the truth. It's really as simple as that. And it's easy to say, but hard to do, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, not so simple.
Well, the principle is simple. The application of the principle is hard. Then the second part that behavioral science teaches us is that people want to be understood and accepted, right? That's a basic human need, right? We're social animals. And so when people do things they're not supposed to do, they give themselves permission to do that by rationalizing, right? And so in an artful interview, you've got to be able to talk about rationalizations like you understand and accept them, even when that's really hard to do. Because subjects' rationalizations frequently shift the blame. They'll blame anybody else except themselves. And so in an interview, you've got to be able to engage in a discussion with the subject and talk about his or her rationalizations in a way that makes them understandable and acceptable. Now that's hard because you talk to a pedophile, right? There's no reason to justify what they did. And you listen to rationalizations like, this is love and attention that got out of hand, or this is her parents' fault because, she should have over at their house, or it was what she was wearing, right? Now you mentioned blood boil, hear all that, right?
Yep.
But the bottom line is you have to be able to listen to that and engage in conversation with them like that's normal.
What if you can't?
So then you're not going to be very successful in the interview, right? Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is influence this person's behavior. And in order to influence this person's behavior, you've got to engage with this person. And if they see you as a threat, and if they see you as disgusted, then they're going to shut down. They're not going to engage, and you're not going to be able to influence their behavior.
So you have to also look at what your goal is and keep that in mind as you engage with the subject.
1,000% right. I call it keeping your eye on the prize. You got to keep your eye on the prize. A lot of these interviews, Charlie Price doesn't go to the interview, right? Charlie Price stays outside and Special Agent Price comes in. Because I did a ton of interviews with child pornographers, and I got 4 kids. Like, I when I'm talking about their victims, I'm thinking about my kids, right? That's like, oh my God, it's horrible. Well, that's why my personal feelings had to stay outside the interview, right? One time I messed up. I was doing an interview. I frequently was called in to do interviews on other people's cases, because I kind of had a knack at doing this. And I was called in to help somebody. And this guy I was talking to, he was making the distinction between molesting teenagers, by 13, 14, 15, and molesting children. And he was telling me there's a difference. And you know what? In a nanosecond, I lost the interview because when he made the distinction, I said, like that effing matters. And the minute I said it, Jerry, I knew I screwed up, right? And I was like, oh no,
Did he shut down?
Of course he did. Of course he did. It's like, and I wanted to reach out and grab the air that was transmitting my words to him, somehow shove it back in my mouth. But the real me showed up, right? I forgot my purpose. I lost sight of the prize. I didn't keep my eye on the prize. My disgust with his rationalization came forward. And guess what? Shut down. I blew it. Big lesson for me, man. You gotta stay, keep your head in the game the whole time, right? So you've got to be able to talk to subjects about stuff that doesn't make sense to you, that you find repulsive, and you got to talk to them just like, it makes total sense, because people want to be understood and accepted, and you don't want them to be able to see inside your head.
Well, tell me more about the art.
Yeah. So the art is, their science tells us how to understand, predict, and influence human behavior. The art is applying the science in real time with a real person when it really matters. Okay. So it's moving from the theoretical ivory tower academic discussion to real life when there's a real human being sitting on the other side of the table. And make no mistake about it, that interaction, it's a battle. It's hard. It's hard because for your subject to tell you the truth, it might send them to prison, or it might send them to Gitmo, or it might send them to death row. So they're really incentivized not to tell you that. And so this is a battle. It's also hard because, like in any battle, the military has a phrase. They say the enemy has a vote. And the military says no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Both those statements are true. Same is true at a subject interview. The subject is to be working against you he or she is going to be working his plan to keep you from getting to the truth. And it's not a cookie cutter process. Like it's not like you do X for 10 minutes and do Y for 20 minutes and, do Z for 15 minutes and then bake at 350 and out comes this perfect confession. It's not like that at all. Each person's different. So what works on one person is not going to work on the other. And you got to figure out what makes the person sitting in front of you tick and develop a strategy for that. And so like in a military battle, in this battle, there's key terrain that the victor needs to occupy and control in order to win. The key terrain in this battle is the 6 inches of real estate that lie between the subject's ears. You got to get inside your subject's head and identify what psychological buttons to push that will result in the truth popping out of his mouth. So understanding the subject is the single most critical part of this entire process because everything else flows from that understanding. It's about the person on the other side of the table. It's about how they see the world and their rationalizations. And it's a custom designed plan to deal with them. So you take behavioral science and you apply it in an artful way, and that results in an artful interview. The best way, I think, to explain this is by example. I'm going to take you now behind the scenes of 4 actual interviews I conducted, and we're going to kind of dissect them and figure out what I did, what worked, and why it worked.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So the first one, we're going to start with an enemy combatant. Now, this is the only one where I'm going to have to change a couple little things around in this interview. This is a real interview, but the interview is classified, right? So I got the lifelong obligation not to reveal classified. So in order to make sure I don't violate that, I'm going to change the who, when, and where about this interview, but I'm not going to change the how. I'm going to change what happened in the interview room and how I got this person to confess. Let me just kind of set the stage generally, right? And so again, I'm going to make up the who, when, and where. But in 2004, I was deployed to Mosul, Iraq. I was the head of the FBI's Mosul operations base there. And just by way of background, Mosul is a Sunni city, and there's Sunni and Shia Muslims. In Iraq, Sunni Muslims were the minority, the numerical minority, but they had the power because Saddam was the Sunni. Most Iraqis didn't like us being there, but that in Mosul, they definitely didn't like us being there, right? Because they were losing their power and Saddam was getting knocked out. We were on the east side of the Tigris River. Tigris River runs right through Mosul. On the west side was the airport. And so there was a lot of traffic between headquarters and the airport. If you were an insurgent, you didn't have to, be Irwin Rommel or, Montgomery or Patton to figure out if you could lay some roadside bombs on the ingress and egress to those bridges, you'd be able to kill a lot of Americans. And they understood that and they were being very successful because we were trying to fight this insurgency. And we're trying to figure out who this person was. So in my made up example, let's pretend we got the colonel that was in charge of insurgency. Now remember, historically, after the regular war, the Coalition Provisional Authority disbanded the military. The military took off their uniforms and went home, but they didn't stop fighting. So let's say that the guy in charge of this thing was a colonel in the Iraqi army. What would you say to that colonel when you went in to interview him? Now, remember, behavioral science says people do what's in their perceived best interest. So we need to understand how the colonel perceives the world, right? Because this is all about the person on the other side of the table. Now, let's talk just for a second about perception, because this is really, really important. Perception is the way a person sees the world. Now, the way you see the world is one way to see the world, but it's not the only way. If I ask you, hey, Jerry, who's George Washington? You'd probably think, well, that's kind of a stupid question, Charlie. He's a combat hero. He's our first president of our country. He's a good guy. Matter of fact, he's such a good guy. We get his birthday off. We all stop work. It's a national holiday just to celebrate the fact that he was born. He's a national hero. And you'd be right. That is who George Washington is. And that's the answer you would have gotten in 1776 if the flag on your uniform was the flag of the Continental Army. But if the flag on your uniform in 1776 was the Union Jack, the answer would be very different, right?
Right.
He'd be an upstart. He'd be a brigand. He's an ungrateful lout. He'd be the person with the unmitigated gall to try to create treason against the crown. He's an ungrateful lout that should be crushed under the boot of the crown. That's who George Washington is, if you're British in 1776. So who is George Washington? Well, it depends. It depends on your perspective. So I'm about to walk in this room. So who's this colonel? Who's this guy I'm walking into? Well, from my perspective, he was trying to kill me for 2-3 months. So I don't think he's a very good guy. He's the enemy, right? But my perspective of him, what my personal feelings are, hey man, you tried to kill me for 3 months, but you weren't successful. I got you. You didn't get me. So kind of payback's a bitch. That would be my personal feelings. But Special Agent Price can't do that. I have to lock those feelings up on the outside of the interview. And Special Agent Price needs to walk in. Well, who is the colonel? He is a patriotic Iraqi doing his duty, protecting his country from an armed invader.
Which is you.
Which is me. Exactly. That's exactly right. There's a good guy and a bad guy in this room. And he's the good guy and I'm the bad guy. That's his world. And guess what? He's me if the Russians came to Chantilly, Virginia. I'd be the insurgent leader. And if the Russians captured me, all the talking in the world is not going to convince me that I'm a bad guy. And so I'm not going to be able to convince him that he's a bad guy. And he sees me as a bad guy. So the real question is, can I change the way he sees me so that he will engage with me? Because I got to get him engaged so I can hop in his head and start trying to influence his behavior. So what do? I walk into his room. I'm wearing a military uniform. And the first word out of my mouth is, sir. I said, sir, do you mind if I ask you a question? Now, what I was wearing and that first word were purposeful. I wanted to look like a military officer, so I wore a military uniform. And I said, sir, because I was younger than him and I would have been a junior officer to him. And in the military courtesy, they address senior officers as sir. So I said, sir, do you mind if I ask you a question? Now, he didn't engage with me, right? He just kind of didn't answer. I said, hey, sir, I just got a philosophical question for you. I'm just trying to figure out. I said, hey, I went to West Point. Okay. And at West Point, they taught us that as a military officer, we are being entrusted with the treasure of our nation, the lives of the men and women under our command. And we have an obligation. At West Point, we call it duty, honor, country, right? Our duty is to resist until resistance is futile. But when resistance becomes futile, we are to stack arms and not waste the lives of our men, not waste the treasure of our nation. Do you have the same philosophy? And he kind of looked at me and he was bemused and he kind of chuckled a little bit, and he said, and kind of like you explained it to your dumb younger brother, like he just kind of chuckled, like, we're the same. What don't you get? But Jerry, that's what I was looking for. We're the same.
Wow.
Right? Because now I'm not the bad guy. We're the same. We're both military officers serving our country, right? That's what I was looking for because I needed him to engage with me and I got him to tell me we're the same. So that was the first step, getting him to engage, getting a hook at him. Hey, we're the same. We're two military officers talking now. I said, well, sir, I don't get it. If you're supposed to resist until resistance is futile, why do you still fight? Because now this is 2004. And I said, hey, we've killed Uday and Qusay. We've captured Saddam. We're not going away. And nobody's coming to help you. So do you really think you're going to win? Isn't resistance futile? Like, why are you still fighting? Isn't your duty not to waste the lives of your men? That was the first theme. Do your duty. Don't waste the treasure of Iraq. The second theme for him was, I said, I don't get it. Maybe it's a cultural difference. And we started talking about cultural differences. And I brought up the fact that in the Middle East, I said, I'm a long way from home. I'm like 7,000 miles away. And I understand in the Middle East, there's different culture here. And we talked about how in the Middle East, people have a long memory and they're prideful. And that, if you get into a dispute with somebody and you knock them down, you've got to stand there with your foot on their neck, right? Because they're duty bound to get up and knock you down. And if they do that, they've got to stand with their foot on your neck. And this tit for tat stuff has been going on for centuries, right? And he said, oh yeah, that's true. Oh yeah, no, that's really true. I said, hey, sir, we're different. America is not going to stand with its boot on Iraq's neck. We're going to rebuild this country and get out of here. And I said, you don't have to believe me to know this is true. You just have to know a little bit about history. Look at Japan and Germany in World War II. We rebuilt both those countries. We defeated them first, then we rebuilt them, and then we left. As a matter of fact, maybe we did too good a job rebuilding Japan because they're doing it to us economically, but they couldn't do to us militarily, right? And so isn't your duty as a senior officer in the Iraqi army to be involved in the rebuilding of Iraq so that Iraq can stand up and rejoin the world community as an autonomous nation? Isn't that what your duty is? And in rebuilding Iraq, we got a lot of choices. Shouldn't you be involved in the rebuilding process so that you can rebuild Iraq in a way that is a good way? And then we began to talk a little bit about Saddam. And we talked about, now this guy was a senior officer in the Iraqi army, and he was a Sunni. So he was like kind of in a privileged group, right? I said, I've been told, sir, that even if you were in Saddam's inner circle, if he got the smallest whiff of disloyalty, he would do wildly brutal things to you and your family, unspeakable things. And we talked about some of those things. And he said, yeah, that's actually true. And I said, and he probably didn't get it right all the time. So they might have been an incorrect assertion made against somebody's loyalty, and doesn't matter. These terrible things happen to him. He actually started to tear up because I think that probably happened to some friends of his. And he said, yeah, that's right. And I said, well, sir, isn't your obligation to not only be involved in the rebuilding of Iraq, but to rebuild Iraq in a way that no one can ever do that again? No small group can force bad things on other people. Now that appealed to him in two ways, right? Because guess what? The cultural differences are going to come into play now because the Shias are going to be in charge, and they're going to probably want some payback against the Sunnis. So he wanted to be involved in a process to make sure that inappropriate payback can't happen. And legacy is big, and family's big in the Middle East. I said, isn't that the best gift you can give to your 7 sons and their sons and their sons, to rebuild Iraq in a way that can never happen again? Isn't that the best gift that you can give? Wouldn't that be a good legacy? So I said, sir, I don't get it. I'm only asking you to do your duty. Do your duty. Don't waste the lives of your men. Do your duty. Be involved in the rebuilding of Iraq, and do your duty. Rebuild Iraq in a way that Saddam's cruelty can never happen again. When I pitched it that way, you know what happened, Jerry? He gave it up. He gave everything up. He gave up the network, who was in it, where they were, how they communicated, where their stash houses were, where their explosives were, where they got the explosives, who were the bomb makers, where they got their finance, how they communicated, their organizational. He gave it all up, the entire thing.
So what you did was separate loyalty to Iraq from loyalty to Saddam.
Right. I changed his view. I didn't change who he was or what he was. Didn't change his motivation, which is to do his duty. I just changed his perception about what his duty was. You're a high-ranking officer. You have a duty not to waste the lives of your troops, to be involved in the rebuilding of Iraq and make it better. So I didn't ask him to be disloyal to anything that he thought was important. I just changed his vision about how he was supposed to accomplish his duty, and he gave it all up. Now that's an artful interview. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't waterboard him.
And you mentioned waterboarding, and I do want to make sure everybody knows that at the very end, we're going to talk about those enhanced interrogation methods like that and your opinion on them.
Sure. But this colonel in the Iraqi army, I just talked to him. I climbed in his mind and I started pushing some buttons, psychological buttons, and I changed his perspective. That's the art in the artful interview. The proof of the pudding is getting the confession. All this stuff works. And the confession is at the end of the day, it's the proof that it works, right? But they didn't teach us that at Quantico. I came in a couple years after you. I think you came in 82. I came in 85. They didn't teach us that there.
So where did you learn how to do all of this?
Well, you know what? Funny question. I lucked out. 7 years into the Bureau, I was a WFO. I was on the squad with a great agent, Brian D-U-E. And Brian used to always come back with confessions. And one day I asked him, I said, Brock, what do you do? He said, hey, man, there's a way to do this. I went to this school, the Reed Technique School out of Chicago. I went there and they opened this new world to me about, influencing behavior. And they taught me about detection of deception. How do you tell when somebody's lying to you? And then they taught me about rationalizations, and they taught me about, they have a procedure for which they apply to get somebody to confess. And so I went to that school. It caused me to look at this in an entirely different way, because prior to that, I've been pretty successful in subject interviews, but it was always laying out the evidence. But then I looked at that time where I had all the evidence. And I'm like, well, why didn't this lady give it up against her co-conspirators? And it was because it wasn't about the evidence. She was involved in a romantic way with one of the persons. So she didn't want to give that guy up, because what was more important than the evidence to her? Her relationship with this guy. Her perceived best interest was about maintaining a relationship, not about minimizing the criminal consequences or judicial consequences of this, right?
So I understand how this works, the loyalty thing works in, your interview with an enemy combatant, but how does that relate to a corporate executive?
So I can't say that all corporate executives are the same, right? It depends on the other person, and they're all different. You have to actually understand the specific, unique human being on the other side of the table and what motivates that person, and then change that person's perception. But let me give you an example of a corporate executive. I did one interview, I think it was in 2009. It was really kind of interesting. I got a call one day from a victim who was a very squared away person. He was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And so he called me to make a criminal complaint. He laid out what happened and he was very squared away. So he not just his assertions, but a ton of evidence that he gave me on that telephone call. And so it was pretty clear to me that this guy was really smart and is a critical thinker. And he laid out in a very logical, methodical way what happened and corroborated all his assertions. So I'm thinking, well, this looks like there might be some there here, right? And then the very next day, I got a call from another victim who was the CFO of a large company and same thing, right? Very square away person, made his assertions, made the allegations against the person and supported that with a ton of corroborating evidence. So based on these two interviews, Jerry, on the telephone, by the way, I'm thinking, hey, there's probably a crime here, but it was a Ponzi scheme. Okay. And Ponzi schemes are large and complicated and they take a long time to investigate, right? Because you got to get all the records, you got to talk to all the victims, blah, blah, blah. Well, I didn't do that. After talking to both these people just on the phone, didn't even go outside the office. The very next thing is me and another agent went to the subject's house and we rang the doorbell at 6:00 in the morning. And several hours later, we came out of that residence with a signed statement confession, not just to the Ponzi scheme, but to two other multi-million-dollar frauds.
Okay. You're going to have to tell us how you did that.
That's kind of unusual, right? They wouldn't teach that in Quantica, right? It starts, as it always does, on the other side of the table. Who is my subject? Who is this CEO that I'm interviewing? He's a very smart guy. He's very savvy. He's thoughtful, but he's also very arrogant. All right. And that's who he is. And so I used all those things, his smarts, his savvy, his thoughtfulness, and his arrogance. And I developed an interview strategy around those. So here's what I did. I rang a doorbell. And I said, hey, I'd like to talk to you. I've talked to, and I told them the two people I talked to, and they've alleged that you're pulling off a big Ponzi scheme. I don't know whether that's true or not, but let me tell you what's going to happen now. And I said, hey, if that's not true, then you should sleep like a baby tonight, because I'm a pretty good FBI agent and I've been doing this a long time. So if their allegations are false, sleep like a baby because you got zero problems. I'm going to get this cloud away from your head. And I'm going to exonerate you. But if you did it, you need to work on some damage control and you need to do that pronto. Because let me tell you what I'm going to do. This guy, what he was doing was he belonged to a hoity-toity country club here. He had a coffee bean business and he was approaching his country club buddies. And he said, I'm having some supply chain issues in Colombia and my manager down there, I'm going to have to fire him and I'm kind of in a cash flow crunch. So can I borrow some cash? And he was allegedly paying them very high interest rates for short-term loans, right? And then he says, as soon as I get the cash flow crunch done, I'll repay you. So anyway, they did, right? And again, this guy's, he had a very fancy car. He had box seats, the Skins, box seats, the Capitals. He lived in this huge house in Great Falls. He looked the part because he was bloated. I said, let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm not Sherlock Holmes, but I don't need to be Sherlock Holmes on this. I'm going to subpoena your bank account. And they gave you money so you could send it to Colombia. I'm going to see if it went to Colombia. And either it did or it didn't, right? You say you're trying to fulfill a contract with Folgers Coffee. I'm going to contact Folgers and find out whether you actually have a contract with them. You say that you've been trying to push this guy in Colombia, who's your country area manager. I'm going to look at your phone records and see if I see a lot of phone calls to and from Colombia. As a matter of fact, I'm going to cut a lead down to Colombia to have the legat or the local cops down there talk to him. Or as a matter of fact, I might fly him back up here so I could talk to him. And then we'll look at your emails and look at all the assertions you were making your buddies once you didn't pay him back. And I'm going to look for false statements there, right? So right now what I'm going to find. You're going to know whether I'm going to see money flowing down to Colombia. You know what I'm seeing, when I talk to Folgers, you know when I look at your phone records, you know when I see when I look at those emails. So you know right now whether or not I'm going to be successful. And, Jerry, when I was talking about those things, I could tell from his reactions that he had done it, right? Because put the shoe on the other foot. If you thought that there was a guy in Colombia that could exonerate you, what would you say? Hey, I'm flying that guy over tomorrow. Charlie, you can talk to him tomorrow because I'm going to fly him up for tomorrow. I'm going to give you all my records. I'm going to show you all the stuff because I didn't do it. He didn't say any of that. He just listened. He was processing. He was like, oh man, they're going to do that. And I know what they're going to find. I didn't send that money to Colombia. Oh, they're going to call Folgers and they're going to find out I don't have a contact with Folgers. So I walked him through all of that. And then I said, hey, you know what? Based on your responses, I kind of think I know what I'm going to find. I'm going to find out you did it because your responses here haven't been consistent with what an unjustly accused person would say. Now I'm going to play on his thoughtfulness and his arrogance. I said, look, I only expect you to do what's in your best interest. And what's in your best interest is not the same thing as what's in my best interest. So I'm confronting a brutal truth, which the casual observer might say, bringing that up cuts the wrong way. No, he already knows that. I'm just putting it on the table. And in doing it, I'm gaining credibility. I'm saying, hey, you need to look out after you, and I need to look out after me. But for a very brief period of time, what's best for you is the same as what's best for me. Because I don't want to have to conduct this big old long investigation. And you're no dummy. You know what I'm going to find. So the question is, how do you put yourself in the best position possible now going forward? Then the other thing I did is I said, you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, should I get a lawyer? Most agents might not think of doing that.
They'd be afraid of bringing it up and the guy saying, yeah, I think I'm going to get a lawyer.
Yeah, I brought it right up because I knew he was going to think about it. Let's just deal with it. I said, hey, you know what? Let me tell you, you call a lawyer right now. I'll tell you exactly what they'll tell you to do. They're going to say, very politely, walk those guys out of your house right this very second and then beat feet down in my office so we can talk about it. So that's what a lawyer will tell you. But what happens next? This is where his arrogance and his distrust of lawyers, because he had been involved in some civil litigation that cost him a lot of money. So I used that to my advantage.
And you knew that?
Yeah, I knew that from the victim interviews I did.
Okay.
Right?
That's an important point to make. You can do this type of interview without having any evidence, but you have to know who your subject is.
Right, exactly. That was the key, right? Because I thought this guy's smart enough to figure it out. This only works on actually really smart crooks, right? Because he's thinking strategically. He's thinking down the road. And so I said, hey, so what would a lawyer say? A lawyer say, walk him out and run down here to my office. And the lawyer say, what's going on? And said, well, I'm accused of a multi-million-dollar fraud. And then I took advantage of his distrust of lawyers. I said, and what's a lawyer going to do when he hears multi-million-dollar fraud? He's going to jack up his retainer. His retainer just went from 50,000 to 100,000, or maybe from 100,000 to 300,000, right? Because this is a multi-million-dollar fraud. You live in this big mansion. You drive this ultra fancy car and you got money to pay. And what is the lawyer going to see? He's going to see a payday. And I'm going to start conducting my investigation. I'm going to do all those things. That's going to take a while. And the lawyer's going to stay in touch with you. It may reach out to us. And guess what? He's going to start running down that retainer. And then he's going to ask you for more money. I'm going to gather all that evidence. But at the end of the day, you don't need a lawyer. You need a magician, because magicians make stuff disappear. All right. And so then what's going to happen? Then he's going to look at that and say, we can't beat that evidence. So all you've done is created a 2-year process where you're under the gun and under investigation, where you're spending a ton of money. At the end of the day, you're still going to get to the same place. Let's get there now. And he's going to say, well, now we need to think strategically. He's going to say, how are we going to plead this out? What are we going to do to minimize the negative consequences of your behavior? Well, I said, you can think strategically right now for yourself, because what your lawyer's going to say is, we can't make this stuff disappear. So we need to figure out how to put ourselves in the best possible position when you're standing before a judge who's going to decide what the consequences of your action are. And you're going to say, I'm sorry. And guess what? Judges hear I'm sorry every day. And they hear I'm sorry for people who are just sorry because they get caught, and it's people who are legitimately, truly sorry. And judges have a great calibration of figuring out who's sorry because they got caught, who's really sorry. And that's by actions. Actions speak louder than words. So what you need to do is think ahead and say, how can I influence that judge on that day? How can I put myself in the best position? And I said, here's what I think you need to do. You want to put yourself in a position where you can say this, hey, Your Honor, I screwed up. I've lived all my life up until now as a legitimate, upright citizen, and I had a business problem and my ego got in the way. And I started borrowing money and I fully intended to return it, but I couldn't square away my business. The snowball got rolling downhill and I just couldn't pull out of the dive. And my moral compass was screwed up. I stole from a lot of people. I stole millions and millions of dollars. But guess what? The minute the FBI agents came to my door, it was like an epiphany. The clouds parted. I saw things in the right way. My moral compass reset. And I've been doing everything in my power since that morning to making it right. Starting with acknowledging what I did was wrong and trying to get it right. But I said, you got one chance to make that argument, which is right now. You can say, Roger, I didn't even try to go to a lawyer. I acknowledge responsibility right away because that's the kind of guy I am. And you need to see this for the aberration it is and look at everything I've done to make things right. And guess what? He gave it up.
Wow. So it worked.
It did work. But once I got the confession from the Ponzi scheme, I wasn't finished because my experience says, well, once they start stealing in this way, they'll steal in a bunch of different ways. So we got the confession on the Ponzi scheme. And then I said, hey, is there anything else? And there was this pause and this kind of look in his face, which told me, hey, there's something else. And I said, hey, remember, you're trying to tell the judge your moral compass got messed up and now you're on the right course. I said, if there's anything else, you got to tell me about it now because it's going to come out in the investigation. And if you don't tell me about it now and I do find out about it, then your whole argument goes away because you didn't really confess to all of your stuff. So it's an all or nothing. And then I explained to him about the sentencing guidelines. Sentencing guidelines, how they bracket it. And once you get up in the multi-millions, there's tens of millions of dollars between guideline ranges. And I explained to him how the guidelines work. For your listeners, the guidelines are kind of like a chart. And on one axis of the chart, it's the criminal history of the defendant. So somebody that has no convictions is one end and somebody with a ton of convictions is on the other end of the axis. And then it's the offense. And so you get points on fraud case for the amount of loss, multiple victims, leader organizer. There's a ton of enhancements. And so this guy had stolen enough so that there were multiple millions of dollars before he got to the next guideline bump. In other words, till he would have to be doing more time. It's really kind of free stuff. And so he gave up 2 additional frauds that I had no idea about. He says, hey, if I'm really going to tell the judge I'm making it new, I got to put it all on the table. So I got confession to the Ponzi scheme and I got confession to 2 additional frauds because he's thinking about pitching the judge and he wants to get it all done. Now that is an artful interview.
Yes, it is.
So it wasn't a custodial interrogation. So he didn't have a right to have a lawyer there. So I could actually continue to talk to him if I wanted to. But even if he would have gotten a lawyer, I would have tried the same tactic with the lawyer because what I was saying was all true, right? I was going to do all that stuff and it would come out the way I talked about it. One of the tactics here, and one of the very important points is you've got to set the stage, right? And you've got to try, especially in custodial interrogations, because the minute they say the L word, the dreaded L word, the lawyer word, in a custodial interrogation, you got to stop. So there's a separate kind of strategy around that, which is how do you engage with the subject without them saying anything? And so typically what I do with that is if they're in custody, I've just arrested them. I'd say, hey, listen, I don't want you to say a word. I'm going to tell you what's going on here because today you're going to need to make some decisions and I want to give you some information so you can make a well-informed decision. But I don't want you to say anything at all. I want you just to listen and you're going to get some information and it can't hurt yourself just by listening, right? That's a tactic that I use to get them to let me talk to them without them talking. It's also a lie because when I say you can't hurt yourself just by listening, nonsense. Because just listening, that's the functional equivalent of cracking your door open a little bit. I'm going to shove my foot in your door so you can't slam it on me. And then I'm going to talk my way
all the way.
Damn right. I'm going to get into your head. But in order to get into your head, I need to engage with you, but I need to engage with you without you invoking your right to a lawyer. So I'm going to tell you, don't say a word. I'm going to give you information so you can make an informed decision. That sounds like a pretty good deal, right? But in reality, I'm saying, would you please open your door a crack so I could put my foot in there? And then I'm going to talk to you some more and I'm going to get you to open the door wider and let me walk in. And now I'm going to be inside your head and I'm going to start pushing buttons.
isn't going to interview the subject at the beginning of the case risky? I mean, most of the time we do all kinds of things, including searches before we interview the subject. So they may be aware that we're investigating, but we still don't interview them until we know everything. So is this risky?
It is risky. And I was fairly far along in my career. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that a new agent do this, but I analyzed that risk, Jerry. To your point is 100% right. And I said, okay, if this dude knows I'm investigating him, what evidence could disappear? What bad things are going to happen? And what can he do to muck me up, to throw sand in the engine, or to gum up my investigation? And I looked at it and I'm like, you know what? A lot of this stuff is historical and he's not going to be able to alter these records. So I thought the downsides of that were not very high. Generally, what you said, a lot of people do that, right? Hey, I'm going to talk to everybody and look at everything else before I talk to the subject, because it does arm them better when they go into the interview. But the other way of doing that is you can lock a subject into a statement right away. And I call it Gomer piling it. I'm like, golly, can you just explain? I'm just starting here. And you can lock them into a story and use that locked in story to help the case. But it is risky. And so I wouldn't do it on every case. But in this particular case, the circumstance of the case, I didn't think I was going to lose anything, even if he shut the door and said, get out of here, talk to my lawyer.
So the way you explained this is that this was the type of guy who did something illegal because he was desperate. His business was suffering. I worked economic crime, white collar crime, all of my career. But you also have these type of guys that are they're con men. They are going out for this scam. And I would think they're a lot more aware of these type of techniques. And I'm not sure if this would work on somebody who thought that they were smarter than you.
A couple of things. You're right. The con men are the toughest, right? And we're going to talk about it in con men in just a second. So I pretended like he was a legit businessman. The background is he really was. He had done multiple big frauds before in other countries, multi-million-dollar frauds in other countries, and came here. But I pretended like I didn't know about that stuff because I wanted to create the illusion that he could pitch himself as a legit businessman. So that was another part of my strategy. But to your broader point, yeah, con men are tough, right? As a matter of fact, the hardest interview I ever conducted, toughest one, period, was of a con man. This guy stole the life savings from 3 Alzheimer's victims. And that was really tough because he did one-on-one contact with the 3 victims. So what happened between them? Only he and the victims know. And guess what? The victims have Alzheimer's, so they can't testify. So I'm really screwed at the beginning of this case because I got nobody that can testify about what actually happened. Now, we all think we know what happened because no one would give their life savings to this clown, but that's not admissible evidence and it's not proof beyond reasonable doubt. No one cares what I think. They only care what I can prove. So I had problems because I'm never going to get out of these victims what the heck happened. And he's got a great defense. He said, yeah, I know all those people and they gave me this money. That's because their family was ignoring them and I was helping them out. And yeah, they gave me all this money because it was a gift. That could be a great defense. How am I going to disprove this?
Before you go on, why don't we talk a little bit about what a fraud is and what you have to be able to establish?
The basic elements of a fraud are somebody lies, somebody relies on their lie to their detriment, and something of value, usually money, flows to the liar, usually from the person being lied to. So no matter how complex the fraud is, you can break it down to those 3 components. Somebody lies, somebody relies on the lie to their detriment, and a benefit is transferred based on the lie, usually to the liar.
And that's what you meant about the Alzheimer's victims, is that they're not going to be able to say what this guy told them that led them to giving him their life savings.
Exactly right. I still don't know to this day what he actually told them. And then it was worse because one particular victim, when he took all the money in this person's bank account, they had a property that didn't have a mortgage. He started getting loans of the property. Not only did he steal all the cash this poor old man had, but then he started encumbering the guy's home with loans from the bank. Oh, it was a terrible case. He was taken from defenseless people. The bad guy's name was Larry. Larry knows I have no witnesses and I have no admissible evidence of the intent to defraud. So you roll all those things up together and it equals a big, hairy, ugly problem because this entire case was based on the subject interview. It's either going to be a grand slam home run or a strikeout and a terrible miscarriage of justice because 3 Alzheimer's victims are not going to get justice. He was in jail. Now I got to Mirandize him, right? And he says the L word. I got to roll out of there. No interview. So I was like, oh God, this is tough. So what did I do? Well, I tell everybody, you got to plan out your interviews, right? I got to break my interview, break it down into bite-sized pieces. Otherwise I'll get overwhelmed. First, I got to get this person to see me or talk to me. I got to have a hook to get them to talk to me. Then I got to agree to not just talk to me, but to agree to be interviewed. I got to get him to waive his rights. I got to get him to admit I am that black male, because we had a lot of witnesses say this black male keeps coming by the house. I got to get him to admit that he defrauded each victim. And then I got to get him to admit that to write his submissions down. So those are, 5 or 6 steps. I got to have a plan for each and every one of them. I'm going to go to visit the prison and talk to him, but I got to do all those different things, right? Plan always starts on the other side of the table. So with an understanding of the subject and how he sees the world. So who's the subject in this case? He's a con man. And that means he's used to reading people and playing people, taking advantage of people. He's used to assessing people and figuring out who can be a mark, who can be somebody he can take advantage of. But he also knows that anyone in law enforcement is a threat. So my question is, can I change his perception of me so that I can get him to see me as something other than a threat? Can I change his perception so he can see me as a mark, somebody that he can use? That was the strategy. I'm going to become a mark. I'm going to make him think he can use me. That was the key to this interview, right? So how do I become a mark? I practice a ton. I went to people on the squad. I said, hey, come sit down with me for 2 or 3 hours this morning. I want you to be Larry. And I'd tell them a little bit about the case, and then I'd interview them and they'd be Larry. And the interview would go however they wanted to go. And I would learn something about that. Then I'd go to the next person on the squad. Hey, can you be Larry? And I did the interview of the second agent as Larry. And it went a little bit different than the first. And they tried different things. And then I did the third agent. So each time I did it, it was slightly different. And I'm developing plans. I must have done 30 of these practice interviews because I realized I only had one shot at this. And finally, my squad is like, would you stop already and go interview this clown? What I was learning, Jerry, was each and every time I interviewed another agent, right, they would do it slightly different. It's Larry's first time being interviewed by me, but it's my 31st time interviewing him. I don't want an even playing field. I'm going to tilt the playing field.
Yeah, you had the advantage. But let me ask you a quick question.
Sure.
One of the things that I did during my career, whether it's right or wrong, you're going to tell me in a minute your opinion on this, is that I never wrote down questions. I knew areas that I wanted to cover, but I felt that if I wrote down questions, that may not allow me to defer from those questions. If there were follow-ups or something, I may fail to go in a different direction. When you're talking about planning this interview to this extent, are you writing down all these questions that you're now going to go down the list and ask?
So I am writing an interview script, but it's not the questions I'm going to ask him. It's like, what am I saying to get inside his head? In other words, plan A is this, plan B is this. In any of these big interviews, I would have done it a lot of times. And yeah, I write down for myself, how am I getting in? What's my first step? I say, you got to get him to open the door. And here's 3 different ways to do it. It's like a game plan. But Jerry, when I get in the interview, it's just for planning purposes. I physically have that piece of paper with me, but I don't refer to it because now I'm just executing.
Since you know this stuff, and we've got a lot of people listening, many of them agents and people in law enforcement, what do you think about writing down actual questions?
I would actually write them down, but I would only look at them at the end, right? Because like you said, I wanted to have a good flow, but I did have a list of questions. I did write them down, but at the end, I looked at that list of questions and said, did I cover everything?
And that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense because now the subject, it's not to your disadvantage that you have these questions. By the time you pull them out, you've already gotten most of your information. So it's not going to be looked at as...
I actually try to make my interviews like a conversation. And even, writing notes takes away from that. I obviously have to take notes, but sometimes they interrupt the flow of the conversation, right? So anyway, I got to go to this prison and get this guy to confess. Everybody has perceptions, right? And I wanted to take advantage of his perception, try to create some misperception. So the day before I went to this interview, I took my suit, my Joseph Bank, buy one, get 17 free suits, and I kind of followed it up. My wife looked at me and like, what are you doing? I said, I'm getting ready for an interview tomorrow. She like rolled her eyes like, oh, whatever. It's like, oh God, here comes another goofy thing, right? And the next morning I put that suit on. It was kind of wrinkled and I looked unkempt. And I tied my tie like 3 inches too short. So it was like it stopped way before the belt. So it looked like a nerd. I didn't know how to tie my tie. And then I put not 1, but 2 pens in my little pocket. I was thinking about putting a pocket protector, but I thought that'd be going overboard, right? So I want to create an illusion like I'm not a very squared away person, kind of like doofus. And then when we got to the prison, you know how things are in prison, right? Information is key. People are always listening and looking around. So when they called Larry down to the warden's office to interview him, and I asked the warden, can you call him down there and have him sit outside your office before we talk? Making myself a mark started before I even talked directly to Larry, because when I knew that Larry was outside, I started talking to the warden about my kid's swim team meet. It was on a Wednesday in the summer and they had swim team meet. I told him I needed to be home by 6 because I was going to be a timer at the swim team meet. I had to be home on time. Kept talking about that, sending out a message that, hey, this guy's really focused on getting back home. And then when I talked about one of the main victims in the case, I kept pronouncing his name wrong on purpose because I wanted Larry to know this dude doesn't even know how to say the name of the victim. He can't be that squared away. We walk out of the office and then he looks at me, crumpled suit, tie tied too short, had a tie bar on. Nobody wore a tie bar, but I did. I looked like a doofus. And I walked in there. I had a slow talking twang. We've gotten the interview and the warden said, can I sit in? I'm thinking to myself, no, I don't want you there because Joanne, my partner, and I had planned this out. We don't want you to monkey their plans. But he was a warden. So I said, okay, yeah, sure. And it was his prison. But I put him in the back so Larry couldn't see him. So I could just deal with Larry. And I said, hey, Larry, I'm here to investigate this case. One of the relatives says that you've defrauded their relatives and that you're responsible for pretty much every bad thing that's happened in Fairfax County. And I'd like to talk to you about this guy. And I kept pronouncing, and I called it Believance. I'd like to talk about Mr. Believance. Real name was Blevins. And Larry's kind of eyeing me up on one side, down the other and stuff. And I said, so I'd like to talk to you, about your dealings with Mr. Believance. And he paused and you could just see the wheels turning. And he said, I don't know if I want to talk to you. And he didn't say, I don't want to talk to you. It's just like, he was thinking out loud, like, I don't know if I want to talk to you. The minute he said that, Jerry, I stood up, closed my briefcase, put the locks down on the briefcase, looked at Joanne and said, we'll be able to get up to Northern Virginia pronto. And I said, hey, thank you, warden. And I got ready to roll out of there. And now Larry's thinking, this dude doesn't even want to talk to me. And again, I stand up, he sees my tie's too short. I got the stupid tie bar on, the wrinkled suit, don't know the name of the person. And then he says, hey, Mr. FBI man, hold on a minute. Not so fast. Every story's got 2 sides, and I want you to hear my side of this story. The guy's playing me. He said, this moron here, because, the other thing I said when he was outside the office, I said about the grand jury. I said, there'd been a grand jury. Now, when Larry hears grand jury, he's like, oh man. So they're going to hear one side of the story. So he sees me now as a way to get his side of the story to the grand jury. I rumbled through my briefcase and I looked for an advice of rights form. It's all crumpled up. My briefcase is a total mess. Looked disorganized as hell. Getting him to talk to me is his decision. I'm ready to leave. I don't want to talk to him. And he basically orders me to take his statement. In order to do that, we got to read you your rights. Okay, no problem. And then I'll let him tell a story. He knows that they've identified him. He is smart. He acknowledges contact with all the victims. And he acknowledges getting some money, just like gas money, or they buy him a meal, but no big money. And I'm like, thank you, Jesus. Because I didn't know where he was going to go with that. But he chose to go with, I got some money, not a ton of money. And I'm like, great. That's the best thing for me. Once I get all that stuff down, he knows all 3 victims. He had dealings with all 3 victims. He is the black male that's frequenting all these 3 houses. And he's got some money, just gas money or whatever, maybe a lunch or 2. Then after I get him all that, and of course, while I'm getting all this, the warden keeps looking at me. The warden's actually behind Larry, the way the room was organized. And he's looking at me like, are you the dumbest FBI agent in the history of the FBI? Like, are you believing this? And I was trying to ignore the warden, right? But it was hard to do because he was like giving me the eyeball. He was a distraction. But then we got to that point in the interview. Then I stopped and very dramatically, I drew a line right across a piece of paper. And there's multiple, pages of notes by that time. And in my true voice, I said, Larry, I was born at night, but not last night. And everything above this line is a bunch of bull. I said, you don't think I can read a casino record? You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars gambling. You got pulled over on 66 in a limo with like 3 or 4 hookers that the casino gave you because you were losing so much money as they were transporting you back to your house. You don't think I understand that? You don't think I can read casino records? You don't think casinos keep a record of high rollers? I said, Larry, you've got a gambling addiction. You've lost, I forget how many hundreds of thousands of dollars. Your gambling addiction is kicking your butt. That's why you've been in and out of jail a bunch of times. It's going to continue to kick your butt for the rest of your life unless you can do something about it. I said, addictions are a hard thing, Larry, and you got to feed that addiction. But what are you doing? You're not sticking a gun in somebody's gut and robbing them. You're not selling drugs to kids. You're stealing money from people that don't even know the money's missing. That tells me you still got a conscience. Well, you need to get a handle on your addiction and deal with this. Jerry, the look on his face is like, oh man, dude, I got you. I said, Larry, you need to do some damage control, man, because there's no way in hell you can account for that money and you're screwed. You're done. So I said, you need to figure out your next play here, man. It seems to me your next play is to try to kick this addiction. What did I do there, Jerry?
Rationalization again.
Exactly. I've changed the bad guy. Larry's no longer the bad guy. His addiction is the bad guy now. So now the conversation is like, how do you fight your addiction? I said, the first thing in solving a problem is acknowledging you have a problem. People like to be understood and accepted. Reframing this whole thing. I'm going to try to help Larry out.
You're there to help him.
We're from the government. We're here to help, right? So what does Larry do? Now, Larry's smart now. He's like, oh, damn, they do have those records. Oh, he's right. He's got me. So he says, yeah, I really do need your help. Can you help me with it? I said, yeah, I can. As a matter of fact, they have a thing at prison where you can deal with addictions. You need to get that, right? Then he acknowledged it, but then I had to get him to write it down. The vast majority of my confessions, I got a signed statement. And there was a little bit of a stutter step. I wrote the statement out, but Larry is like, he was stuttered before he signed it. He really was pausing. I go, Larry, let's be honest with what's going on now. You know that the minute you sign this statement, you're totally screwed and there's no way around it. But guess what? You're already screwed, man. There's 3 people in here. There's the warden, me, and Joanne. We're going to testify. They're going to believe us about what happened here. And for all you know, I got this thing recorded. I did, but I threw that out there. And so you lose nothing. And so he signed it. But I wrote the signed statement up in a way that made it easier for him to sign. Let me just talk for a second about signed statements because they're really important too. So Jerry, our whole discussion is about how do you get people to confess, right? But what is a confession worth if it's not admitted into evidence or if it's not believed? It's not worth anything. So how do you position yourself so that when you do get a confession, you can get it admitted into evidence and people will believe it? And the answer to that is through a signed statement. A signed statement is a transition from a verbal confession to a written confession. Now, this is another one where a lot of people do it a bunch of different ways, but I'm not so sure the conventional wisdom is right. A lot of people have the subject write their statement. I don't do that. I write the statement. You know why I write the statement? Because I know every element of the offense and I know the sentencing enhancements. And every element of the offense is going to be in there, as are the sentencing enhancements. But another reason, and the most important reason why I write the statement, is I got them to confess with rationalizations. The statement is heavy on rationalizations. Most of the statement may be rationalizations because that makes it easier to sign. Because the rationalizations are like mayo, right? They make everything go down easier. So the very first substantive paragraph in Larry's statement, I'll read it to you. I have a gambling problem and I have defrauded a number of individuals and financial institutions in order to get money, which I use to support my gambling addiction. Okay. I actually upgraded it from a gambling problem to a gambling addiction in one sentence, right? He's got an addiction and this is what this is about. I'm trying to feed my addiction. All my signed statements, when you get them to confess, right? There's rationalizations. Well, I put the rationalizations right in there. It's heavy on rationalization because that makes it easier to sign. That was the first substantive paragraph. But the first actual paragraph is the preamble. And the preamble says the same thing every time. You're making this statement in connection with a criminal investigation about, I'm making the statement freely and voluntarily. No threats had been made against me. No promises made to me to get me to give this statement. And I'm giving the statement because it's true. So freely, voluntary, no threats, no promises. This statement is true. That preamble makes this statement Johnny Cochran proof. Because the defense attorney is going to try to poke holes through this. And a lot of them have. but it's not going to work, that preamble. And then I write a summary of what they told me, heavy on themes, but I include every element of the offense, which the AUSAs really like, and all the guidelines enhancements. And then if I can anticipate some defenses, I'll put those in there too. Now with Larry, I was thinking, this guy's probably going to say, he promised me that this would be wrapped up into my state time and I wouldn't have to serve any federal time. So the very last sentence of Larry's statement says, I hope to receive help for my gambling addiction and request that I receive this treatment when I'm serving my federal time. So I masqueraded that as, please give me some help.
That was innovative.
I'm looking at the statement again. It says, for each and every one of these victims, I knew that the victim suffered from diminished mental capacity, which is a sentencing enhancement. And then I make mistakes in here. I try to make some obvious mistakes so they correct it, right? Why do I do that? On the witness stand, I've never had a confession suppressed, but I've been to a ton of suppression hearings. The defense attorneys will say, hey, you specialize in this. Yes, I do. Matter of fact, you've got a national reputation for doing this. Yes, sir, I do. You teach this stuff nationally, internationally. Yes, I do. So you're an expert at this stuff. Yes, I am. So you're really slick and savvy. Yes, I am. You're so slick and so savvy that my client would have signed anything this slick and savvy guy did. Well, no, sir. He just didn't sign what I wrote. I made some errors in here. He crossed out the errors and corrected them. That means he reviewed this really well because he found my errors. Checkmate. He modified it and then he adopted it. But it doesn't always work that way. I want to share one final kind of war story from my interview with a spy.
Yeah, I would imagine that's a little bit more difficult because they're as trained in interview techniques as you are.
Well, you're exactly right. They go to spy school. And in spy school, there's classes for what do you do when you get caught. So they actually are professionals. They're tough. They're trained. They're smart. They have experience and they're experienced in preventing the detection of deception and obfuscating stuff. And they're a worthy opponent, right? So in this particular interview in 2007, I got approached from the department, from the Justice Department, from a prosecutor I'd worked for before, who said, hey, or maybe it was this case squad that reached out from the FCI folks, the foreign counterintelligence folks at WFO. And I'd never worked FCI ever in my career. He said, hey, we're getting ready to take down a case and can you help us do the subject interview? And I did this a lot. I would go with the case agent. The case agent obviously knew all the facts, but I had the interview part down pat. And so what we would do is I spent probably a week or maybe two with the FCI guys learning about the background of the case and learning all the ins and outs. And they've been working this case for a long time. And this guy, and I won't get too far in the weeds, but you know, most spies are posted here under diplomatic cover, right? So what that means is they come here with a diplomatic passport and they're like the, deputy economic attaché or whatever. And so if you catch them, the only thing you can do is PNG him. They declare him persona non grata and send him out of the country. But this particular guy here was not under diplomatic immunity, which meant and again, it's been a while since I did this interview. I forget. I don't know if he was actually a knock. That's somebody that's a spy that's working on non-official cover. So in other words, they're not attached to the embassy. They're just a civilian. If you catch a knock, you don't have to PNG him. You send him to jail. So the folks operating under non-official cover, not only did they go to spy school, but they weren't the C students in spy school. They were the A students, right? Because they're going out there without that safety net, right? So we developed a plan to approach this guy. And Jerry, to your point, I'm like, oof, this is another hard one because this dude, whether he's a formal member of the intelligence community or not, he's savvy. And so I'm going to assume he's a knock. I'm going to assume he graduated from spy school, Phi Beta Kappa. And I got to develop a plan based on those assumptions because that's the worst case scenario. So he was living in Greenville, South Carolina. And what he was doing was there's dual use technology, right? And dual use technology is technology that has a military or defense use, and then it also has civilian uses. And the export of that technology is restricted. Rockets and missiles, they have computers on there and circuit boards, but those circuit boards are particularly stout, right? They can work notwithstanding the vibration that comes with a missile launch, and they can work in different atmospheric conditions because atmospheric pressure on Earth is different than it is at 30,000 feet where the missiles get launched to. Up at 30,000 feet, it's really cold. So they have special circuit boards that can operate under high pressure and low pressure under high and low temperatures, and they can withstand a lot of vibrations. And so those are restricted. Now, they also have civilian uses. You can put them in a deep sea submersible. So what this dude was doing was, he was basically in the supply chain for the government of India. He had this business down in Greenville. He was ordering all these dual-use technology parts. But as part of that process, he had to sign an end user certificate saying the ultimate user of this is my company. But he was lying because he was sending all this stuff back to India. So he was part of their supply chain. And so he was acquiring this technology that India apparently couldn't get on their own and sending it back to India. Now I got to get a plan on this guy. And what do I do? Well, he was living with his wife and his kids. And so when I started planning this interview, I'm like, okay, I'm afraid of interviewing this guy because it's going to be really hard. I got to get a lot of plans, but he's also a husband and a father. I said, I don't want to give this guy time to think like a spy. I don't want him to remember back to spy school and the classes of what do you do when you get caught. So when we hit that door, and you know how that goes, right? It's just very disruptive in the morning. Everybody's scared, like what's going on? The people with the blue vinyl jackets with the FBI on it, they're walking through the house. And what's going to happen? His kids are going to be upset. His wife is probably going to be crying. And so my plan started with, I want to get this guy out of the house in 90 seconds if I can. I want to get him dressed and out of the door in 90 seconds because in those 90 seconds, he's going to be thinking like a husband and a father. Because his wife is going to be upset, his kids are going to be upset. And I think as a human being, he's going to be worried about them first because they're the most immediate problem. So I want to get him out of the house before he starts thinking like a spy. And we did that. We got him dressing out of the house, toot sweet. Now he's in the car and we're moving. Do I want to drive 20 minutes back to the office in Greenville and let him think? No. Because now my assumption is the minute we walk outside that house and he's not in front of his wife and his kids, he starts to think like a spy. And he's searching his memory banks like, okay, what am I supposed to do now? We did that interview 2 blocks from his house. We drove out of his street. I think we banged it right. We went down 2 blocks and we pulled the car right over to the side of the curb.
And that was the plan?
Yeah, because I didn't want to give this guy any running room to start getting ahead of me thinking wise. And I started writing in my pitch. And I said, hey, I don't want you to say a word. I want to tell you what's going on because today you're going to have to make some decisions. And I don't want to go into the entire pitch, but I went into a pitch and I got a confession from him. Okay. It's probably not classified, but I just don't want the other hostile intelligence services ever listen to this. Not going to get that plan from me. But I had a hook. I told him, don't say a word, right? Let me tell you what's going on. That was a hook on purpose because he is thinking like an intelligence officer. So he's got to understand the landscape. So understanding what's going on might be important to him, right? So he can develop a strategy. And I laid out my strategy and he gave it up in the car, verbal admission, case agent there with me, a driver, me and the case agent. So we got it. And then we started driving to the office. Then I started nonstop talking to him about a ton of other things. Why? I still didn't have it written down. And now he's thinking like a spy, but he also needs to respond to my question. So his brain's got to be a dual core processor. Like he's got to respond to me. That's why I keep talking to him, getting him to talk.
You don't want to give him that time to now start thinking like a spy.
Well, he is, but he's doing it less efficiently than he would be if he wasn't talking, right? Because I'm sure that stuff is running around through the back of his head, but he's also got to engage with me, right? And so we got up to the office. I said, I'm going to write a statement out that summarizes. I went over the statement. And he says, is that what you said? That's my understanding of what you said? Yep, that's it. So I write out the statement, right? And then the case agent starts talking to him to keep him distracted. Same thing. Well, I write the statement out. And I write the statement out and I write out exactly what I told him I was going to write out. And I said, now review inside it. I had one of those big pens in the briefcase, with the 4 color pens, red, green, black, and blue. And it's a good thing I had that in there because when he went to review a statement, he says, I'd like to make a couple changes. I said, okay, no problem. And I'm thinking he spotted some of the errors I had in there. He did. He changed those. But here's the changes he made. I'm going to read one of the paragraphs after the preamble. I wrote, I have knowingly used my company to assist the government of India's military and defense community, blah, 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 in acquiring technology, blah, blah, blah. He changed that to said, I have unknowingly, he crossed out and deliberately. A little change, black to white.
I did it, but I knew I was doing it.
It wasn't deliberate and it wasn't knowing. And so he went through this and changed knowing to unknowing. And he basically changed the entire thing around. And then every time he reviewed it, he made more changes. Okay, click, now green, click, third time around, blue. This thing is hilarious. Why the different colors? Because every time he reviewed it, he made different changes. So I could actually record those. It's 8 pages. He changed stuff, but he didn't change this sentence. He says, while I have, through my actions, assisted and acted as an agent of the government of India, I have not been in the employ of any Indian intelligence agency nor have I received any money or gifts from the Indian intelligence community. So that's actually a pretty nice sentence, right? They'll call me an intelligence officer. But the first part, while I have through my actions assisted and acted as an agent of the government of India, that's a crime unless you register as a foreign agent. So he changed everything in here, but he didn't change that sentence because he didn't know that that was a crime too. But guess who knew that? I knew that after the FBI guys told me. I didn't know at the beginning, right? But I put that in there, but I teed it up as comparing it to I'm not a spy. I just helped him out. Guess what? He pled out, and his defense attorney had a tough time because he changed everything in that statement, but he didn't change that. That's a lot of mayonnaise that made that statement go down easy. And that's why I write the statement, not my subjects, because the statement I write is a tool, and I'm loading it up with all kind of good stuff in there that they may or may not pick up.
And the disadvantage of it not being in their own handwriting, because that gives it a lot more weight, I would assume, with the court and with jurors.
Right. So it does. But remember, they're making changes and marking it up. And I always ask them to write an addendum if they have anything else. Is there anything else I forgot to say? And sometimes I'll purposely leave something out and so they can do that same thing. But you're right. It would be more credible if it was in their handwriting. But guess what? 28 and a half years in the Bureau, never had a confession suppressed ever. And I never even got to the jury because each and every person I got a confession from pled out. So it didn't matter, right? Because they pled guilty because their lawyers were like, we can't surmount this. We can't get around it.
Well, none of the techniques that you talked about today include what you see on TV and movies where somebody is shouting and yelling and threatening, and they certainly don't include enhanced interrogation techniques.
Well, a couple of reasons. One is they're not legal in the United States. Okay, so we don't use them because they're not legal. But the second thing is, if you take legality off the table or morality off the table, they're not necessary, and they're not particularly effective. How many times did they, waterboard Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? Hundreds, right? I don't know how many times. If they were that effective, why would they have to do it so many times? And here's the thing about enhanced interrogation techniques, Jerry, and this is the saddest part about the whole thing. Post September 11th, the CIA went and tried to solve a riddle. What are we going to do if we catch one of these guys? How are we going to get them to talk? They're jihadists. They're religious fanatics. What are we going to do? And they turned to a retired Air Force colonel, who's a psychologist, and they said, can you help us understand this? Tell us what to do. And from that colonel's work, developed the enhanced interrogation techniques. Now, that colonel was associated with military's SEER school. SEER stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape. It's the school that they send military personnel who are going downrange and they may find themselves behind enemy lines. And they teach them to survive, evade, resist, and escape. And what they did was they took the techniques that he taught them to resist in SEER school, and they reverse engineered them. They learned to use them offensively. But they didn't ask the question of, are these things effective? I'm sure they're loyal Americans. I'm sure they're trying to do the right thing. They're doing it in the wake of a national tragedy. They talked to a lot of people, but they didn't talk to the right people. They should have talked to Brad Garrett. Brad Garrett is a buddy of mine. He's an agent at WFL. And if they would have talked to Brad, they would understand you don't have to do all that stuff. Brad actually talked to 2 terrorists prior to September 11th, and he got both of them to confess. And one of them gave him a signed statement confession. And that guy actually invited Brad to his execution. The first guy is Ramzi Youssef. Ramzi Youssef was the first World Trade Center bomber. Brad interviewed Ramzi Youssef. He was the nephew to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, architect behind September 11th. He interviewed Youssef and got a confession from him. And the second guy was Mir Amal Khan. He's the guy that stood outside the CIA January 25th, 1993 and shot people as they were trying to take a left turn into the agency's headquarters. Brad was case agent in that case, captured him in Pakistan, interviewed him, got a signed statement confession from Kanzi. And Kanzi stayed in contact with Brad because people like to be understood and accepted. And Brad treated him so he understood and accepted why he did it. He maintained a years-long relationship with Brad, actually invited Brad to Kanzi's execution. And so if the guys from the CIA would have asked Brad, they would have found out about all the techniques we talked about today. And they said, you don't have to torture anybody. You don't have to waterboard somebody. You don't have to slam anybody into a wall. You don't have to put somebody in a coffin and throw bugs in there. don't have to hang them from the ceiling by their arms, naked, make them cold, deprive them of sleep. None of that. You have to use science and art. You have to understand their perception and switch it so they believe that it's in their best interest to tell you the truth. And if you can do that, they'll tell you the truth. But this stuff is hard. It takes a long time, right? You got to have science. You got to have the art. You got to have a hook. You have to have a plan. You got to keep your eye on the prize. You got to understand their perception. You have to hop in their brain, hit the right psychological buttons. And then when you do all that, you got to get them to write it down and reduce it to writing and have them sign it. That's an art, but it's not the conventional wisdom. And it's not about coercion. It's not an interrogation. It's a subject interview. Those words matter. But all this stuff here is not well understood. And that's why we went down a road we shouldn't have gone down.
We see so many of these innocence projects now, and you learn more and more every day about false confessions. And usually those false confessions are the result of interrogations where people were threatened and coerced.
So 2 good points. Number one, the Reed technique has gotten a lot of heat for producing false confessions, okay? Because it's so effective. But there's a very easy way to avoid that. Once you get a confession, then you go back and you get details about the crime that only the person who did it would know. And that's your corroboration. So you don't stop at the confession. You go back and you get all the details, because if they can't give you the details, then there's a problem. And that's how you separate a false confession from a real confession. You get them to give you all the details. And second of all, to your point, Jerry, yes, sometimes it does work. When people are getting tortured or physically abused, they'll say anything they can to make the abuse stop. So when somebody breaks in a confession where you're physically harming them, how do you know it's the truth? You don't. And if it's some time sensitive thing, maybe they can run out the clock, right? If I got the bomb planted somewhere, you gotta find out within 10 hours, right? All I gotta do is send you on an 11-hour wild goose chase. By the time you figure it out, I was telling you a lie, the bomb already gone off. Not hard to do.
Fascinating. This has been absolutely eye-opening. Now, I've done a number of interviews with people on interview techniques, but you went into a little bit more details, especially when it comes to getting confessions and obtaining signed confessions. So this has definitely been a next level case review on interview techniques. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, no, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about it.
I think people are always curious as to how my guest became agent. So my standard question to you is, when and why you joined the FBI?
I joined the FBI in 1985, and I grew up around the FBI. My dad is a retired agent, so it's kind of like the family business. Been a part of my life for 61 years. So I was initially not interested in being an agent. I wanted to be in law enforcement, but I didn't want to be an agent because he was a street agent for 10 years, and then he went into management, and we got transferred out a lot. So I went to 4 different high schools. I didn't like all the movement. But then I learned the difference between a street agent and management. So a street agent doesn't have to transfer around like that. So I decided to be a street agent at the FBI. I was a career case agent.
And what were you doing just before you joined the FBI?
Believe it or not, I was an accountant with Arthur Anderson. I was a CPA, right? And so the fastest way in the Bureau in the 80s was to be a lawyer or an accountant.
In Enron, right?
Yeah, that's what the investigation I avoided. But yeah, exactly right.
When did you retire?
December 31st of 2014, about just 7 years ago almost.
And what have you been doing since? Because as everybody knows who listens to this episode, no agent actually retires from the FBI.
They don't pay us enough so we can actually retire with the capital R, right? I spent several years doing corporate investigations. I went to a consulting firm and started an investigations practice. And my clients were the corporate boards and C-suite folks and general counsels. And I did internal employee investigations or investigations where they were the victim of crimes. For a time, I was the chief security officer for a Fortune 500 company. And now I am executive vice president of a privately held company. The owner of the company, she and her partners own about $5 billion worth of real estate around the DC and Baltimore area. And I help her run her company.
So we're at the very end, and I like to give my guest the last word.
I just say to anybody thinking about a career in law enforcement, the FBI is the way to go. It was the most fun and exciting job I ever have. If I could, I'd go back there tomorrow in a nanosecond. It's a great job. And I also would say, in the last 3 or 4 years, the FBI has become, in the press at least, very politicized. Don't listen to that. It's really important that when an agent knocks on the door to talk to Ma and Pop Kettle, they need to understand it's not a Democratic FBI or a Republican FBI. It's just the FBI. We need the public to help us solve crimes and prevent terror and catch spies. And regardless of whatever spin both parties try to put on it, the everyday agent is just following the evidence where it takes him or her.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a couple of photos of Charlie Price and links to several articles related to this episode. There's one from the FBI website about the current state of interview and interrogation. Charlie mentioned the Reed method of interviewing, and there is an article from John Reed clarifying misrepresentations about law enforcement interrogation techniques that you might want to read. There's an article from Charlie about artful interviews, an alternative to mining data, and there are links to other FBI retired case file review episodes featuring interviewing skills. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. And make sure you follow FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.